Okay, so let's start. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Intersection of Policy and Technology. I am Kuhu Chauhan, and it's my pleasure to host you for this exciting session. As we all know, technology is reshaping our world at an unprecedented pace, and public policy plays a crucial role in navigating these changes. And to ensure that innovation serves the greater good, today we have an exceptional panel of experts who bring unique insights and experiences to this important conversation. Let me take a moment and introduce our esteemed panelists and our moderator. We have with us Mr. Abhineet Nair, who is a distinguished expert in technology policy, currently serving as a researcher at the Center for Internet and Society, with extensive experience across roles such as project associate at the International Innovation Corps and senior consultant at Satva Consulting. His work spans policy analysis, research, and consulting. An ALS Fellow and Young Leaders for Active Citizenship alumnus, Abhineet offers a unique perspective on the intersection of policy and technology. Welcome, Abhineet, to the webinar. Next, we have is Mr. Omer Kumar, who is an accomplished professional specializing in AI policy, currently serving as a policy analyst at the Center for Responsible AI at IIT Madras. With previous experiences at Zomato and PRS Legislative Research, he has developed expertise in communication, research, public policy, and government relations. As a former vice president for the Revolutionists English Debating Society, Omer brings a dynamic perspective to discussions on policy and technology. Welcome, Mr. Omer, for the webinar. And
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And our moderator is none other than our ISPP alumni, Mr. Shivam Tandon, who is an expert in public policy with a diverse background spanning engineering and policy research. He is currently serving as a manager for public policy and research at India Tech Organization. Shivam's experience includes impactful roles at the National Institute of Urban Affairs and L&T with expertise in planning, monitoring, and research. Shivam brings a unique blend of technical and policy insights. We're truly fortunate to have their expertise as we explore the challenges and opportunities at the crossroads of policy and technology. Thank you, Shivam, for agreeing to be the moderator for the session. I think you will be the best person for that. And before we begin, a quick note for our audience. We encourage you to please share your thoughts and questions in the chat box throughout the session. We'll try and address as many as we can during the Q&A segment. And without any further ado, let's dive into this fascinating discussion. Shivam, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kuhu. Not sure if I can be called the expert for tech policy, but we'll try to do our best in unraveling what this sector consists of and what the professional space is. Disclaimer first. I'm not sure if we can call technology a separate sector anymore. Technology is something that has become such an indispensable part of our daily lives that we are using some form or the other of technology throughout our day. So what constitutes as tech policy is very tough to define. But in the next 50 minutes or so, we'll try to peel the layers to understand what all technology policy comprises of. See, whether it's education, it's health, it's mobility, technology is everywhere. So technology actually is working at the intersection of many sectors. And there is one aspect of using technology in governance and policy making, and the other is how to govern the emerging technologies that are coming in. So we'll limit our discussion to both these topics, touch upon a few case studies as well. But given the time constraint, I think we'll take the question answers in the later 10 minutes or so of the session. Just to put some context before I ask my fellow panelists some questions based on their experience. When we talk about technology policy, it is inevitable to relate it to engineering or coding or data heavy statistics. However, when you're working, for example, in a big tech firm, it's not just the technology that you are working with. It's the labor policy, the geopolitics, the finance, um, uh, the environmental policy. Everything comes under your work area, and that makes this space so diverse that intuitively we understand technology as something, blockchain and artificial intelligence and coding and everything. But it's so much more than that. So I won't take much of your time. I'll dive right in. First, I'll ask you, Omer. You have worked in different sectors in the public policy space. You worked with a civil society organization. You worked with a top tech industry, and now you're working in an academic body. Uh, how has your experience been dealing with technology policies with different perspectives coming in from these three different sectors? Some thoughts on the multidisciplinary approach that these three sectors have taken with respect to policy issues that you're working on.
Yeah, no, thanks Shivam for that question, and thank you for ISPP for organizing this and having me. I think great context is that technology is everywhere. I think for all practical purposes, whatever discussion we are having today, especially in India, every sector is being affected by technology. So I don't think we should look at tech policy as a separate sector. Rather, it's pervasive everywhere. Right? So all most of the discussions that we're having that relate to policy do have some element of technology, right? And that has I would say, massive ramifications on society, which I'm sure we'll discuss later on. But I think, thanks for that question. I think what I've learned by working at three different uh, this type of organization is that the first learning has been that there are a lot of different competing interests varying on the type of stakeholders that are engaging with any policy. So if you're working with a legislator has to respond to, of course, the demands and the pressures by the constituency, right? By their political parties. So that's there, right? When you're working at an industry, you have to understand the business model. You have to understand that how these technologies align with the business model, and of course, the kind of ramifications it can have on livelihoods, because these industries, like a lot of livelihoods, are also dependent on these business models, on these industries or different companies, right? And I think thirdly, from an academic perspective, one of my key learnings has been that to first sort of dissect the question at hand, right? To first sort of go into the nuances of the problem, use first principles thinking, and break down the problem, and then probably come to the solution, right? So long-term thinking, right? So I think that has been there. I think my second learning has been that any policy that we see today, right, be that national education policy or a data protection law or any healthcare policy, that is an outcome of years and years of efforts where all three different branches, that is civil society, industry, academia, have contributed in very different parts. And any output that we see today, it's not like, one bureaucrat is writing a policy or an industry body is writing a policy. Different stakeholders are contributing to it at very different points in time. And lastly, it is the government or the executive who's signing off, right? So it also really tells you the kind of importance the executive has in this whole, or legislatures have in this whole ecosystem, right? The kind of importance they have in terms of managing different expectations, because all three different stakeholders bring in very different kind of issues, which are very important uh, and have very significant impacts. So yeah, I think that's broadly been my learning. I'm sure I'll talk more about this going forward.
Thanks, Omer. I think I'll ask you more to speak on the first principle thinking bit and how you're doing your research and how that is important. But before that, a very important point that you raised, that it's not just one bureaucrat who's making the policy in its entirety. I'm reminded of an anecdote where when I was entering this public policy field, before that, I been a science student, so I didn't really know that public policy as a profession existed. But when I was entering, that was the time when national education policy was all over the news. And I thought, wow, when I enter the public policy field, I'll write something like the national education policy for the country. And often people like us who are just entering the public policy field have been preparing for UPS examinations and romanticize a lot with what bureaucracy looks like, what policy making looks like. And Avinit, I'll go to you and want your thoughts more on this, on what are the realities of policy making in the country. Um, and how important is your generalist and your technical background, um, and just what are the realities that someone sitting outside might perceive, and you being in this space for so long have the nuances at hand. So over to you, Vinit.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Shivam, for the question and in general for holding this conversation. Just some context for our participants and attendees as well. I have experience in both research and consulting, and I think if I were to specifically talk about technology policy, right, and I think although we agree that technology is a multi-sectoral concept, it sort of makes itself visible in different sectors as well. But I think given the experience I have, and Omer can also sort of add to that, I think our experience is largely is largely limited to the digital technologies that we are living with today, and they are sort of probably immediate tangents. So artificial intelligence would sort of be an immediate tangent of the digital technology domain that we are living in. So I think if I were to limit my sort of answer to that boundary and to that scope, since that is where most of our experience lies, I think one thing that we should definitely keep in mind is that, like you said, right, it's not an individual process. It is a collective process. But I would like to add to that to say it is also a political process because it is a collective process, right? We often imagine policy making as being analogous to normal document preparation or normal support to MPs or sort of working with the state in some way to support policy making, right? But as third party individuals, as external consultants in a lot of cases. But I think what we often miss out is that this is a political process. The three interests that Omer also highlighted, the Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar distinction that I think we hear very often in public policy. I think it's also interesting to know that all those units are not always on the same page, right? That there is, I mean, especially in the time that we live in, there is oftentimes strong contradiction and tension between the three. So your role as a policymaker, or our role as a policymaker, also in some way is one to identify which interests are we most comfortable aligning with. Because I think unless we are comfortable as individuals working on a problem, it becomes very difficult to sort of find ground in that, right? So one, of course, is which interest group or which kind of area we want to bring that perspective for, and then sort of build our journeys accordingly, right? Like if I am somebody who wants to talk or wants to bring civil society perspective in these conversations, of course that difference and the three-tier system is not fully, of course, appropriate in all contexts as well. But if I were to represent civil society's interest, then that would require me to engage with civil society's thought on issues. So that means interacting with non-profits in some ways. But if I'm somebody who wants to represent the market's interest, then I would have to understand how industry bodies function, how industry organizations function. So I think it's definitely important to notice, one, that this is a political process in almost all cases, and because it is a political process, there will be competing interests at play, and your job in a lot of ways is to, one, be comfortable with the position that you are taking across these interests, and secondly, to then understand that interest as well as possible to make sure that you don't bring in your biases in a lot of cases. So I think that maybe those would be like starting 2 cents, and we can circle back on this later.
Perfect. I think very well put, Abhinit. There are so many actors involved in the process of policy making that you end up working on your inputs are the marginal changes that happens in a policy making. But often those marginal changes have huge ripple effects, and we'll talk more on that. So let's take some cases for some of the most talked about and favorite policy issues like data privacy. And Omer, I'll come to you. You've worked extensively on the draft Digital Personal Data Protection Act, whose rules are yet to be implemented and can come anytime soon. How would you say that, what were the fundamentals of tech policy that you put while you're going through the experience of working in a nationwide important legislation like DPDP?
Yeah, no, thanks. So before I answer your question, I think just two things to add to what Abhinav said, right? I mean, while each stakeholder is bringing their own POV to any discussion, I think what we are currently seeing is that in this whole ecosystem of different players, now different players in the ecosystem are also engaging with each other. You see civil society engaging with industry, industry engaged with the government on various levels, right? You see these policy events happening in Delhi or elsewhere, right? So there is also that aspect where all these players are engaging with each other. So of course, I mean, the folks who want to work in this space, I mean, there is also that aspect that one needs to keep into account because at the end of the day, I mean, it's always as we have said, right? But it's competing interest, but everybody is trying to be accommodated of each other interest to the best extent possible, so they can go to the government with the best possible solution, right? Because the government also expects these stakeholders to talk amongst themselves, come up with innovative solutions to different problems. So that's one. Second, I think I wanted to speak about this is missed on the first aspect, right? As I mean, there is this multidisciplinary aspect, and I would first like to give a brief about the center I'm working at as well, right? Center for Responsible AI. People often think that AI is a technology and only technologists are thinking about this problem, but now this technology is like everywhere, right? Is impacting people in different ways. So you need economists to look at it, you need social science people, right? You need psychologists to look at it, so very different angles. So that's the multidisciplinary angle I think that technology or people working in this space have. So although of course the importance of technology in the room is very important wherever you're having these conversations, right? I don't think that you can have these conversations without them. But at the same time, you need people from different backgrounds as well to also appreciate the kind of impacts that these technologies have, right? For instance, you also need people working on the ground to see that is Aadhaar leading to any digital exclusion, right? I mean, people creating that technology might not be aware, but people working on ground are aware of the kind of implications or unintended consequences that tech can have. That's second, right? Now coming to your, I think, data protection thing, right? Of course, I mean, everybody knows about DPDP and the kind of history it has, but one disclaimer, of course, that as you said, technology is just not about privacy and AI. It is also about nuclear technology or vaccines. I mean, technology is everywhere. But of course, we are not experts in that field. So we're not going to make that the focal point of discussion. But just for all people who aspire to work in this space, there are other spaces where technology is used. So I would highly encourage you to also explore those aspects as well, because we have already a lot of people working in this space. Anyway, so yeah, this data protection thing, right? Of course, I mean, I was lucky to actually witness the DPDP journey from a civil society perspective and also an industry perspective. From a civil society perspective, of course, you learn about the processes of the lawmaking, right? There comes a draft, then people comment, the importance of public participation, right? That public policy. I mean, you need to involve the public. And how do you do that, right? Public consultation and the parliamentary committees engaging with different stakeholders. And of course, then discussion and deliberation in the legislature, right? I mean, just introducing a law or passing it is not enough. It is also important to know, is the law being scrutinized enough by legislators, right? Does the law have enough provisions that prevent it from executive overreach, right? So these are the kind of questions that you think about when you're looking at it, especially from a legislator's perspective, right? That how can you make a watertight law that can stand the test of time and scrutiny? So that's one. And I think from an industry perspective, I got to know that, okay, once these laws are passed or these policies are enforced, what happens then, right? Then, of course, compliance with these laws in and of itself a huge area of study, right? That can the players who are supposed to or industry who are required to be compliant with the law, can they comply with, right? Does the law have enough timelines for them to make suitable changes? Here we are talking about data protection, right? So a lot of Indian companies it was the first time for them that they were being subject to a data protection law, right, or privacy law. Are you giving them enough time to make technological changes within the organization, right? Because complying with the law is a completely different ballgame altogether. You have to make several changes to your product, right? That can have multiple effects on the business and on the consumers as well, right? So does the law take into account that? Third, are the provisions, I mean, I would say, can industries even meaningfully comply with the provisions or not, right? For instance, this Data Protection Act has a provision that I think it says that the notice has to be sent in 22 languages, right? But then the question is that as a company, if you're not providing services in those languages, is it even meaningful to give the consent in those 22 languages? Because then your services aren't not in the language. Is that misleading or not, right? So these are the kind of questions that come up in when you're thinking about complying with the law. Then, of course, the rule making part, right? As you said, that the rules are yet to be made. So that again, it's itself a process, right? That again has to be consulted with the public and other stakeholders. Then, what are the kind of changes that? I mean, I think it's a balance between that. So when you're thinking about a law and rules, then you need to strike a balance between putting things that require flexibility in the rules, at the same time putting the broad principles in the law, right? Because you also don't want a lot of things that require changes in the law, because then you can't go back to the legislature making amendments again and again. That's why you have rules, so that you have that flexibility. But then again, when the rules are finalized and the rules are out there, it doesn't mean that there is no oversight, right? Of course, the parliament has powers, the parliamentary committees have power to examine these rules because they are published by the executive. So are those processes working? Like if you look at our Indian parliament, the committee that is supposed to examine subordinate legislation does not function that well. I mean, you do not take up these rules that are there. And they have, again, big ramifications on how industry or other players are complying with the law, what kind of effects it has. So yeah, I think broadly that's there. But yeah, I mean, to sum it up, I would say that when working from a legislative perspective, you think that okay, law has passed, job done. But then the next task is okay, how do you ensure that the law is actually implemented in a meaningful way, right? Do companies and other players follow the spirit of the law in a meaningful manner that also doesn't disrupt things, and at the same time, you are achieving the end that you set out for yourself when you thought about the law.
Yeah, I think wonderfully put. And I'm reminded of this phrase that we often hear, that the policy was well intentioned, but the implementation failed. We don't often acknowledge that the implementational challenges have to be catered to while designing the policy. And therefore, the need for civil society organizations, industry, and the academia to come together and form policies is so important. And therefore, such a long process followed. I think it took almost a decade for DPDP to come into life. Um, Extending this, I'll ask you, Abhineet, if you also want to share your thoughts on DPDP or maybe the Digital Competition Bill. So we are seeing a lot of digital specific legislations coming into place and policies meant for digital world. I think the world that we are going to live in is inherently different from the world our ancestors lived in because of the digital transformation. And Digital Competition Bill was something that was introduced, I think, a year back, but then it was just a bill, and it did not see the light of the day after that. But what was your experience and your thoughts on what the fundamentals of tech policies are when, dealing with important legislation such as this?
No, I think I think I would definitely echo Umir's point about the multidisciplinarity, and I'm gonna like try and probably throw some light on that as I talk about my experience with working on digital competition bill. But so just some context here, I worked on the digital competition bill in terms of submitting comments to it for the Center for Internet Society last year when the draft bill was released. And what essentially happened with the law was that there was a draft bill that was released along with the report of a committee that drafted that bill. So they provided an extensive rationale on why certain clauses are present in the bill, blah, blah, blah. They did an internal round of consultations with industry bodies, civil society organizations, some organizations, startups, big tech players, etc. And through the consultation process, they reached an understanding that the bill should be a certain way. And then they published the bill for public comments. Everybody submitted comments, but over time, they went through a couple more consultations, and then the bill has been tabled now. So I think my experience with DCB, I would say, is slightly different from the DPA experience or the PDPA experience, because the philosophical issue at core of DPDPA is privacy, which in India sort of got like popular state attention through Puttoswamy, and that was 2017. And you had Sri Krishna and Sri Krishna committee report and the DPA come immediately after Puttoswamy. So the difference or the time lag between privacy being established as a fundamental right to the Data Protection Act was very limited. So we immediately see the right being reflected in the first draft, at least in some ways, right? But the problem with digital competition bill is that competition is a tech agnostic problem. Antitrust cases have been running on from decades. We know Standard Oil ka problem where their monopoly was broken in the US. We know Microsoft, again, a more recent problem, but it has a much richer history. So I think what I was actually able to witness with the digital competition bill was that suddenly it became very necessary for a generally slow moving legal regime to quickly adopt itself to circumstances that were out of its control.
I think we lost him.
Yeah.
Antitrust law in general has moved a little gradually, right? Sorry, am I audible now?
Yeah. Could you just begin from a little while back? Because
I realized I got cut off. Yeah. No, so I was saying that so unlike privacy and DP, I think competition has a much richer sort of history of antitrust law and how it has evolved through legislation, but also through the Competition Commission of India debating issues, right? The level of precedent has been very important there. So I think what I saw with DCB actually was that I think the digital domain we live in and the digital economy we live in, the market dynamics of this economy are very different from conventional market dynamics, right? Like if we see the bigger players, the big tech today, these guys are not sellers in the conventional sense. They are not. Facebook does not provide you a service alone. Facebook is essentially an intermediary between you and ads, right? It essentially plays an ad intermediary role. Google search does most of that. Amazon plays an intermediary role between us and sellers. Uber plays a role between us and cab drivers. So they all play sort of like an intermediary role, right? And what that essentially allows them to do is that it connects their growth to both sides of the market. So the so-called network effects that we talk about, and that immediately turns the market dynamics, upside down. So what we essentially see happen with DCB was CCI actually conducted an in-depth analysis of how these markets turn. They connected with a bunch of economists, a bunch of experts who understand market dynamics in depth, right? And these are academic people who sort of get the economics of it, right? And then they sort of connected with industry organizations. So they did a whole multi-stakeholder process. So to me, I think DCB was a place where I saw how a regulatory regime that is used to a status quo has to move quickly. And it did that very well using precedents that it had itself sort of come to more organically. So it used its own rulings in WhatsApp wale cases. It used its own rulings with other cases to sort of come to a larger conclusion. So I think that was definitely one thing that I think should be sort of articulated through the DCB experience, that the state had to respond very quickly to a problem here. I think the second issue or the second insight that I should probably highlight through the DCB experience is that I think the geopolitics of digital policy making and tech related policy making today is a very under discussed topic in India at the very least. I think we often try to think about digital technologies as a sovereign issue. And of course, there are regions where that is a sovereign issue, right? Spectrum allocation can be considered maybe a sovereign issue. Similarly, satellite construction, etc., can be considered a sovereign issue. But when we talk about globalized markets, when we talk about e-commerce, when we talk about social media, we have to move away from a nation state conception of these issues, right? We have to see that if we are really, really imagining that social media platforms should be the digital public square where people, irrespective of their backgrounds or their marginalized backgrounds, essentially can come and access a larger public square more independently. If that is really the goal we want technology policy to deliver, which I would argue we should, then we have to imagine tech policy in a different way. We have to move beyond the conception of private players owning large intermediaries and sort of concentrating those resources. So I think, yeah, that would be probably the second point. Like the DCV experience essentially really brought out the geopolitical nature of digital economy today. And with what's happening in the US and the EU currently, I think a lot of those conversations have to be much more mainstream, I feel, than they are right now.
Yeah, I think you really brought out the geopolitics angle. I want you to speak more on that, because, like we said before while setting the context, uh, that tech policy is so much more than just technology, right? It's labor, finance, market access, geopolitics, environment. So I'll ask you to speak more on geopolitics a little later. But before that, I'll just touch upon one point which Omer made in one of his answers, that the importance of first principle thinking. Um, we often hear this, that there are many people who are available to work. There are fewer people who are available to think. And while the young professionals entering this public policy space, I think it's very important to get your intellectual laziness out of the way and think, think through things, and cater to so many ripple effects that one policy change can make. So, Omer, how do you see the research area with respect to technology and policy evolving in India? How important is that? Where do we stand with respect to our global counterparts? And how does that play a role between developing the theory and when it comes to the practical implications and those practicing?
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, I mean, great question, and thank you for asking this. Yeah. I would say that in India, at least, public policy is very applied. People often, whenever they think about policy, they often think about, okay, industry bodies and, working at a big tech company, taking part in stakeholder consultations, et cetera, and largely being reactive that, okay, a law has come, okay, let's do an analysis, let's do, like, what are the implications of it, let's suggest change amendments and done, right? I think, uh, first principle thinking is nothing, right? I mean, it's basically just challenging each and every assumption, right? That whatever problem or solution is being thrown at, just asking questions. People call it the five whys, right? Just asking why, right? So I think one is that I would encourage me, young person who's watching this, or me, one who wants to shift to public policy and is personally interested in research, right? That there is a lot of scope in India to actually do a lot of more academic work on public policy, right? And think about the fundamentals of things, because a lot of these things or problems that we're facing today because of technology are not new, right? For instance, infringement of free speech is not an issue. It's not a new issue, right? I mean, it has been like, if you go to political philosophy, you'll see debates by Mill, right, saying that why is free speech important, right? How do you counter false narratives, right? And these are the same problems that we're seeing today on. Abhinit mentioned, right, that Facebook is like a distant space where people are talking to each other, but they are competing in this that, okay, what if there's some harmful content goes out, right? Similarly, competition, right? Again, not a new problem, but the way it is manifesting or the scale at which these problems are presented to ourselves is probably new. But the core of the problem, the core of the issue might not be new. Similarly, artificial intelligence, right? I mean, we've been at the center for responsible AI looking at the kind of problems AI is bringing us. And most of these problems are not new, right? Some of the problems that we're seeing today, let's say fake images, right? It's not new. I mean, fake information or editing images and using it for malicious purposes is not a new problem. What AI probably has done is that made it easy for people to do it, and they can do it at a much larger scale. And so there are some problems that these laws already account for, right? So you don't need to reinvent the wheel always. So that's one. And which I think Abhinit also said that there are a lot of past precedents that you can always go back to and see that, okay, the core of the issue was always same, but now it's a different form at scale in which it's manifesting. And I think second, in terms of when you say that how does India stand in when you compare to other countries, I think this DPTP or digital company is a great example, right? I mean, India has always been late to the party in terms of introducing these laws or having conversation about these things. EU has largely been the leader in terms of starting these conversations. And because they have a rich history of academics, of civil society thinking about these questions way before, right? I mean, when we are thinking about implementing the DPTP Act, the EU has already done most of the work, right? Now they're thinking about, okay, what are the other kind of issues that will face, right? I remember I was speaking to someone and they said that, okay, how does how do you think about free speech in a virtual world, right? When you have virtual reality where people are engaging with it, how do you then think about harm? So they are much more forward looking, and that's happening because they are focusing on fundamental research. So would highly encourage people to work in tech policy that there are these avenues also available, and there is much more work that is required in this space, right? Because as civil society, as academics, you're thinking about these problems, then probably governments will take it up. They invite you for consultation, etc. So you play an essential role in this whole process. So that's there, and I think that's largely what I wanted to say. And but yeah, last thing, right? Just adding to what Abhinav said, of course thinking about these questions is important, but I think also what is important is impact evaluation. I mean, you have these technologies being deployed everywhere, but are people thinking about the question that how it is impacting people's lives, right? Is someone evaluating today that, okay, if AI is being deployed in healthcare, what kind of impact is it having on doctors, on patients, urban patients versus rural patients? How are teachers reacting to it in the education space? Because that then will inform us about, okay, what next, right? How do we then make policies through such evidence? And I think this is where civil society and other on-ground organizations working on ground play a critical role. And again, that's another avenue where people can think about working, who aspire to work in this space. Yeah, thanks. If Abhinay would like to add to this, yeah.
I think maybe I
Yeah.
can, Shivam can jump in and then I can maybe circle back on these parts because I do have some follow-ups, I would say.
Perfect. So no, I think great points, Omer here. I think when it comes to research in India, it's not a very lucrative field that young people, students in their 20s, are looking at ideally. So how can we bridge that gap, be more mature in our research and higher education field, and that can benefit the technology and the policy sector. Also, I think, as you mentioned, EU, right? So I can't help but point this out that we often are intuitive uh, way to go about things is to put regulations in place, and we've seen there is this one joke that floats around the internet that when EU came with the EU AI Act, the number of people in the photo who said that, yeah, we have come up with this act were more than the number of companies using AI in Europe. So, so we need to be very cautious while regulating technology because technology is moving at a very rapid pace. Um, I think we were in that generation which uh, used mobile phones when we were, I think, in late teens. Now people are using mobile phones probably when they are, uh, very little kids. Even before they go to school, they have a digital device on their hands. And also, how rapidly this is evolving is AI is a very good example. ChatGPT, what was a week back, is not the same right now. That is how fast technology is evolving, and regulations will always lag behind the technology. But in a way, it's good that we just want to prevent societal harm while regulating and not curb innovation, which is making our lives better. So Avinit, I'll go to you now. If you want to add more points on this,
Yeah.
please do so,
So,
and also touch upon the geopolitics angle of policy and technology, because technology does not see borders.
yeah.
And so what do you?
Yeah, just two quick points. So sorry, just before Abhinay starts, right?
Please,
You
please
mentioned
go
about
ahead.
research, right? like, yeah, unfortunately, in school or even in higher education, not a lot of emphasis is given on research and writing, right? So I think there needs to, I mean, you need to develop that sort of attitude among students to
Correct.
encourage them more towards research and writing, because that will eventually them lead to probably thinking about these career alternatives as they go forward. And I think second is that to all people who wish to work in research, I can personally say that investing that time in that research and writing process in the long term really gives you benefit. Like you can see the results, right? It definitely pays off in the long run, even if fortunately, unfortunately, I mean, yeah, fortunately, you said it's not that lucrative, right? That might be an issue, but I think in the long run, you definitely see the benefits of you putting that hard work. So sorry, Abhi,
Yeah.
go forward.
No, no.
Absolutely. I think research work is as entrepreneurial as it gets, but it does not get its due credit. But yeah, Avneet, over to you.
No, thanks for that. I think definitely, I think very strongly feel this sentiment. I think I am somebody who's, I think, very organically been drawn to like doing research, especially like quantitative research, even at Satwa. But I think it's really at CIS also where I've been able to do like really in-depth research about tech policy. But I think I would actually like to, I think, circle back on the DCP once, and I think probably give an example that I feel would really stress the point that Omer was also trying to make, the point about questioning assumptions, right? I think um, uh, I've attended a few sort of policy programs that sort of tend to focus on introducing people to policy 101. And I think one of the first things that is often introduced is the unintended consequences of regulation argument, right? I think we hear about that very, very quickly when we are working on policy courses. And I feel that insight is a product of its time, right? I mean, we are. I think I differ from that standing a little, and I think my difference from that really comes in from the perspective of, I don't think that there is a binary distinction between regulation and innovation, right? So I don't often. I think, especially in the case of technology, I think where see this. So okay, let me take a step back, right? I think when I said it is a product of a times, a product of its times, what I meant was that we often hear or have heard this about cases where if the state's bureaucratic process had not come in, then the technological process would have moved, at a good pace, and that essentially means that the state is actually slowing the process down. But I think with digital technologies, I feel the trend is the other way around. The technologies right now, we live at a time where most capital innovation is done by the market, by private entities, and because of the product of the times we are living in, these are largely unregulated, semi-regulated private investments. I mean, that is the point of the market economy. Based on this assumption of regulation opposes innovation, we have created a market economy that sort of makes sure that capital is efficiently allocated to the right people, and they sort of reproduce products and technologies in the right way. But with digital technologies, where we are now heading is that I feel we are essentially disrupting the market's ways to function itself, right? And that is where, to me, competition law sort of becomes a really important topic. With multiple markets being held by single players, we are essentially preventing the market from doing what we expect it to do. Because if we have accepted that this is a market economy, then we need to provide market with all the support that it needs to perform its functions. And I mean, today that means regulatory intervention, because of the structure of the digital economy. If we were to let market function the way it is functioning, then it of course leads to these pockets of consolidation. It leads to monopolization in certain markets. It leads to over dependence on certain players. With app stores, we see this happen consistently. With artificial intelligence, I think Omer brought up this point about impact assessment of artificial intelligence, but to me that should also include market resilience, right? Like because this is a geopolitical conversation, what is the plan with AI here? I mean, even the most successful AI startups are not close to being extremely profitable right now. So, what is the idea that we have behind sovereign AI? Right? Do we want to create foundational models that sort of require that kind of infrastructure, or do we want to create India-based use cases? And the latter seems to be the answer right now. So, I think what I'm trying to say is that regulation can essentially play a very, very catalytic role, especially in these situations where the natural trajectory is towards market disruption, right? Or well, disruption is probably not the right word, but probably market dysfunctioning. So if the natural tendency is towards that, then I think it is actually beneficial to expect regulators and regulatory insight to step in and correct the market. And again, I mean, I am as skeptical of anybody as giving state more power. But when we say, for instance, that laws should have execution also in mind, I think there is also, I mean, I don't want to sacrifice everything at the altar of efficiency. Like, I don't want to dilute my law to such an extent because it is becoming difficult to enforce. Because to me, the point of the law is to meet interests midway. And I think with the DPA, what we also see happening over time is that it has become less touch over time, low touch over time, especially for the state, the exemptions that have been provided to the state and all. So the law has certainly taken a trajectory. I think what is also important for us as people who work on policies to question why this trajectory occurred the way it did. Why was it that the DPA changed these ways? We should read the Joint Parliamentary Committee. We should read the report they came out with. We should read the bills and how they have changed. We should do clause by clause comparisons, because that is where you tend to understand, okay, there's something else happening here, right? Like there are consistent changes. We see that happening with the DCB. This binary of regulation versus innovation, I feel, is probably true for markets where the technology is moving not as quickly. That the state will come in and slow that further down, but where we see markets naturally tending towards a problematic outcome. I think it's EU's example there is pretty valid. I would say they have already imposed fines under DMA. And the entire time we kept hearing that, if the DMA will be applied in the EU, there will be an innovation problem. We won't see people emerging. But as soon as their browser notification sort of was applied to companies there, we immediately see the use of domestically developed browsers sort of uptake, right? And these were browsers that would, in any other event, would not have been able to crack the market. So here is where the regulation came in. It said that Google has to divest its share in Chrome, and that would allow other sort of smaller competitors to come in. So to me, I think that binary has to itself be questioned, especially because, like you said, the environment we're living in is of rapid technological development. So I also don't feel like that regulation should be a bystander and probably come out, and stop bad things from happening. But yeah.
I think well put. I think, especially with respect to digital and competition, we are seeing big tech companies whose overall turnover would be more than some of the countries put together.
Right.
And this does pose the question of how can new entrants, young startups, even get a chance
Yeah.
at making it big? And where is the level playing field? And for that level playing field, policy interventions are necessary. And
Exactly.
policy is meant to drive the society in a way, in a direction where it won't automatically go.
Exactly.
Otherwise, markets will take it.
Yeah, and I think
And we don't.
this is also where research and knowledge of theory would help, right? Because,
Yeah,
like you said, all of us have lived in the times of the early internet, like that broadband modem wala time, and we know how a different internet looked like. We know an internet that relied on more independent blogs, more independent sourcing of information, Google more being dedicated to providing you the right answer, right? But I mean, I don't think anybody would deny that over the last 20-25 years, the incentives under this internet economy has changed. Like, if we are really satisfied with the way that, let's say, social media is currently functioning, because anyway, it's just one player controlling three platforms. So if you're comfortable with that kind of centralized control, then let's just declare that a public utility, right? We've already done that with the internet. There is a reason that there is a more volunteer-based organization like IETF, etc., that manage how the internet standards are written, because we've somewhere agreed that internet cannot be a resource we fight on. So if we feel that social media as a topic or as a sector has reached that stage, then let's talk about making it more of a common utility so that we can sort of at least connect it to the people who want to use it, right? And I feel that is also where engineers need to come in, right? We have to think outside of what the current lucrative business model is. I mean, I get that ads is a great business model, it's a convenient business model, but it is also a problematic business model because it essentially works as a parasite in a lot of ways. So yeah, I think that is also where
yeah.
technologists and engineers need to come in and sort of think about alternative design solutions as well.
No, Abhinit, absolutely. We can't agree that a centralized figure can control the social media. We'll be out of job. But yeah,
Exactly.
so um, yeah, so I think we are in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. If you have any questions from the participants, we'll be happy to take them. You can put in your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, whichever is feasible to you. And do we have any questions right now in the chat box?
Right now, I do not see any questions. I am thinking even the candidates are taking a little time to absorb and understand what are the questions that legitimate questions that they should ask.
No, they can ask
Let's just
any,
give them
no
a
questions are stupid. So,
let them
yeah.
just give us let them give them a 2 minute break to let's see what kind of questions are coming our way. In the meantime, I think you can continue with the discussion.
Yeah. Any more thoughts on technology or public policy in general? Because I don't want to put technology as a separate sector, especially for people who are looking to start their career in public policy. Anything for them? Your 2 cents on them. Omer, do you want to go first?
I mean, personally, I've had this. I mean, currently, you see a trend of public policy as a career or a sector or career stream emerging, right? This wasn't the case earlier. But it's not like people didn't engage or do public policy. Earlier, it was in different forms, right? Earlier, there weren't teams for public policy, but they were like PR teams, the government relations team, different names, right? But the thing or the process is not new. That's one thing. And I think second is that like whenever young people reach out to me for any sort of advice, I just tell them that it's so like public policy in general is so massive, right? Everything under the like everything is public policy, right? So first, I would definitely encourage people before they think to do an NPP, right? Because that's the first intuitive thought people have. Let's do an NPP if you want to enter policy. Probably work at a few places, maybe for internships or if you can get a job at a civil society or anywhere. Uh, Work there. Think about, okay, like it gives you some perspective as to what is public policy, what are some sectors that, you know, pique your interest, and then probably think about a longer term decision of doing further studies in that area. So that's one. And I think second is that definitely would highly encourage people to pick up civil society or academia to start their career if they can. Like personally has done wonders to me and really helps you in the long run. And I think third is that would also encourage people to then pick, but over the course of some years, pick some particular sectors and then do a deep dive into that, right? You want to study further, do a degree that gives you specific knowledge about that particular sector, rather than just going for an MPP or a generalist degree. Because at some point, the only way you'll be adding value is then, as we discussed, right? If you're questioning the fundamentals, going to depth and thinking about these long-term questions. uh, so I think that, and lastly, again, is something that I was thinking today because we were having this webinar is that people should often think about this question that how much of the public is being involved in policy making, right? People should look at different devices that the judiciary, the executive, the legislature has for people to participate in this whole process and then evaluate that are people are people actually able to participate in this whole process, right? And who are the stakeholders who actually end up participating because public policy, right? We want the public to engage because eventually the laws and policy we pass impact all citizens at very different levels. So yeah, would encourage people if you're thinking about research questions, this is something that one should definitely think about and try to evaluate or come up with something.
I think we have one question which is on the career options, and maybe telepathy, but we sort of answering this only. So the question is, what are the early career options and opportunities after a public policy course? I think Omar has put it really well in answering your question. And just to add on to that, I'll just say that please don't think coming into tech policy, you need to be a technical expert at anything. You need to have engineering or data background. As we have discussed, technology policy is so much more than just the technology itself. And yeah, so I think that we have answered. If Abhinit wants to add more, please go ahead.
No, I think that's largely it. I mean, there are, of course, civil society organizations. There are also more consulting focused organizations that you can also probably consider. There are a lot of them who specifically focus on policy consulting, so you can definitely keep an eye out for them. I think I also have research experience. Over also has research experience. So research organization you should definitely consider. Again, you in a lot of cases you may be expected to have some kind of academic experience, but in a lot of cases you won't. So probably interning there and sort of showing that you're sort of able to contribute to the day to day in a more sort of upfront manner, I think would be a good way to establish that credibility. Yeah, I think that probably would an extra add on.
Yeah, I would encourage people with a tech background to also enter policy. I don't see that a lot happening, at least in the circle that I look at. It's usually
Yeah.
social sciences or people from a law background who think of policy as a
I
career
I
option.
disagree. I mean,
Oh, really?
you'll find engineers everywhere.
No, I mean, I feel that there is a dearth, thoda sa. Like, even if there are like a lot of them, I don't know. I mean, my experience has been also a little different.
Yeah,
I think,
I
Shivam,
find
there
yeah,
are a few questions.
yeah.
Right.
Yes. So we have one question on AI. So what should
Yeah.
states like India do on AI regulation, given that the EU has an outsized impact on global conversation with the Brussels effect?
Yeah, I think
Pretty technical, yeah.
this is definitely, I think, a very broad question, and because I think when we say what should India do on AI regulation, I think it is important to first figure out if we mean what do we mean by that? Do we mean a regulation that prevents AI's harms from being percolated to the people who don't have any interest in them, or do we mean how do we create an economy around AI? Because that is a distinction we will have to make, right? The latter would require us to direct regulations in a way that invests in, let's say, homegrown infrastructure, which we currently see happening under the India AI mission. And that is the, I would say, a more dominant route that we have gone forward on. The other, which is protection from harms, is still a much more nascent conversation. So, I mean, if the Brussels effect were real in AI, I would say we would already be seeing some kind of a legislation sort of emerge in AI. But I mean, at the very least, that is not a dominant conversation right now. We already have the EU AI Act, but nothing around India's AI Act is around in the horizon even. So yeah, in what I mean, what should they do? I think is also a very subjective question. I mean, I can probably answer that from the perspective of how should that question be answered, but I mean, others can also sort of add to that. But I do think like answering that question, okay, how should like what should states like India do? The should wala question has to be answered through public deliberation, and that requires people from those industries to be part of it. I mean, I was part of a research study on AI and healthcare recently, and we talked to a bunch of medical practitioners, doctors, etc. Right, and I mean, the insights you hear are insights that you would not come across if you were to read global conversations around AI. So we heard about how doctors often fear a risk of liability because if the AI that they are using has some kind of diagnosis component to
I think Abhinit is frozen, right?
what
Maybe
extent
Yeah.
is the
Oh,
decision
he's
of
back.
that
Yeah,
AI?
it's fine.
So yeah, no, I was saying. Yeah, and I was saying so. Yeah, healthcare, for example, is an area where medical practitioners can be made most part of the conversation. But yeah, the how part is something I think maybe I can focus a little more on. But what should in general happen, I think, is definitely a more multi-stakeholder answer. But yeah, sorry, I think I have a point.
Yeah. I think,
No,
Ume, do you want to?
just want to add in terms of AI regulation in India. Of course, I mean, just because there's a new techno. I mean, first of all, it's not new technology. It's been existing since like time immemorial, 1960s or something. So that's one.
Chess
And
games.
second is that, as I said, right, the harms are not new. So probably the first step when you think about regulation, also, I mean, regulation, as I've been said, right, what do you mean by regulation? Self-regulation or a law or executive action or co-regulation, multiple things. It can mean multiple things. But more importantly, it's important to first understand what the unique problems that India has, because it's not important the kind of problems that EU has, India would have. For instance, when you talk about bias or discrimination, right? Probably in US, the case would be looking at blacks versus white skin color, right? But probably in India, there is caste, there is religion, right? There are so many different layers of identity that India has. So the kinds of problems or the way you define bias or discrimination is very different. First, to understand the context is different. Second, to also then think about what are the kind of harms that we as a country are experiencing and then matching them with the existing laws, right? There's a draft AI governance report as well that is out by the principal scientific advisor that talks about mapping these harms with existing laws and then thinking about this question, okay, what are the gaps that are not, filled by the existing system and then deliberate on those questions that how do you then fill those gaps And then lastly, of course, different questions, right? I mean, even within existing regulations, do regulators or law enforcement authorities, are they equipped to apply those laws, right? Or do you need capacity building measures, right? Do they understand technology as well as at the pace which it is evolving, right? So a lot of efforts around AI education. So yeah, not a very straightforward answer to that, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think policy is highly contextual, and a copy paste can lead to disastrous event. Context setting is very important. What happens in EU is probably not so much relevant to what should or happen in India. I think we are out of time, but there is one more question if we can have 2 minutes more here. Okay. So how should policymakers address concerns like privacy, cybersecurity, and misinformation? A pretty broad question, but if you want to share your thoughts.
Omer, do you want to go first?
Uh, sorry, what? Wait, let me just read the question. I mean, of course, so of course, in the Indian context, previously we have a law, so we are all waiting for the rules. So hopefully the rules come out and they're implemented well. Cybersecurity again, there are again enough rules and regulations in India. So okay, all three issues we have existing laws that cover them. So the law, the regulation part is covered. The question is then that, as I said, right, are the authorities or the bodies that are supposed to implement them, are they able to sufficiently implement them? What are the kind of problems they are facing? Do they don't have enough manpower, right? I mean, you see so many regulators or other enforcement bodies that don't even have like they have a lot of vacancies. So don't even have people to enforce the law, right? So are these the questions that need to be addressed? Lastly, do they understand the issue really well? Because in the context of technology, it is evolving at such a rapid pace that even scientists are struggling to keep up, or experts are struggling to keep up, right? I mean, every second day within AI, there's some new model that is coming from China or some other country. You need to, you just need to see which model has come out today. And yeah, I think that's what I have to say. But for the person who's asking the question, I would encourage them to think about, are policymakers not able to implement or solve these issues? If not, then think about why. Maybe that can be a policy question to think.
We need your 2 cents.
No, I think I mean, Omer's largely covered everything. I think what I would also encourage people to think is that in issues like these, it is important to break them up a little, right? So when we say address concerns like privacy, I'm assuming the problem here is invasion of privacy. And if that is something that we're looking to address, then we should essentially ask the question of what context is this invasion of privacy occurring? Is this an invasion of privacy of my autonomy and my identity from a peer? Is it with a corporate entity that holds my data? Is it with the state that is also sort of surveying over me, using unfair means? Based on these contexts, then there can be appropriate solutions, right? Like we see the control that corporate entities hold over our data still being regulated with the DPA in a lot of extent. But the relationship of our data that the state has with us is much more different than it was in the earlier draft. Similarly with cybersecurity, right? Do we mean cybersecurity problems at the server location? Because then that requires legal means. But do we mean cybersecurity problems at the user location? Like we see a lot of digital scams coming up, and a policy response to a cybersecurity problem at the last point is going to be different from a cybersecurity problem at the server junction, right? And similarly with misinformation, I think the problem of incentives and how those sort of play in the current social media regime, right? ऐसा नहीं है, like Umer said, fake news has existed for a long time, but social media accelerates that pace because it incentivizes that behavior. Like if you actually create a hype post which is not true, you'll sort of get better reach. So it essentially incentivizes the worst behaviors that we probably come to public squares with. So the question could probably under misinformation be that, oh, do we want to bring in something that addresses the incentives here? Because I mean, the other option there is then let's say the state creates a fact checking unit, and again, I think we'll be across the spectrum if we start discussing should the state have the power to declare truth or not, right? Because that's a whole different conversation. So probably a more subtler solution is probably working with the incentives there, finding a way in which we are not essentially incentivizing this behavior. I would say that's largely it.
I think the world would have been so simple if we could answer this in one sentence on how we should address privacy issues.
Yeah.
But great, I think very insightful comments. And I think the attendees, I hope so, that the attendees have something worthwhile takeaways from this webinar. And with this, I thank you, Avinit, Omer, and Kufu and ISPP's team for this initiative. Yeah, that's it from our side. Kufu, over to you for any final thoughts.
So it's just, I want to thank all the panelists, Mr. Avinit, Mr. Omer, thank you for being a part of the webinar. Shivam, for being so candidly, agreeing to be the moderator for this session. It was a wonderful session. Thank you so much. And I look forward to invite you to ISPP campus soon to interact with our scholars. I'm sure they'll have n number of queries for you. So with that note, and thank you to all the attendees who took out the time on a Wednesday evening and joined us for the webinar. Thank you, everyone. And with that note, goodbye, good night.
Thank you so much.